Stop. The people who could not hold you were never meant to. This is a transmission from the Arcturian High Council, and it has reached you at the exact moment the separation process became undeniable in your life. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly why your life has felt like separation, what is being removed from your path, and what the Arcturians already know about this phase. But here is the first revelation. The relationships that have grown distant, the circles that have quietly closed, the spaces where you once belonged that no longer feel like yours. None of that is coincidence, and none of it is failure. It is the visible surface of a deeper process already underway, a selected line separating from an older environment, a route being refined, a path being narrowed with precision. The Arcturian High Council has already mapped this pattern. What you have been living through, the growing distance, the sense that ordinary conversations no longer reach you, the feeling that your life has been contracting around you without your permission, is not loss without meaning. It is preparation with a purpose you have not yet been given the language to name. You were not rejected. You were separated, and the separation did not begin when you noticed it. It began long before the distances became visible, long before the silences became permanent, long before the old circle stopped being able to hold what you were becoming. The algorithm did not create this moment. It only delivered it. The timing was already set by the process itself. Like this transmission, if you know your life has been narrowing for a reason. Comment 111 if you know this message reached you at the exact right moment. Comment 777 if you feel the old line is already falling away. Comment I was separated if you now recognize that what looked like rejection carried a deeper meaning. Share this transmission with someone who feels alone, cut off, or misunderstood, and cannot explain why. Subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path if you are ready to understand the separation instead of blaming yourself. You were guided here because the separation is already active, and yet, for most of you watching this, the word rejection is still the word you reach for first. It is the word that lives closest to the wound, the one you have used to explain to yourself why the table felt smaller, why the room felt quieter, why the people you counted on began to move at a frequency you could no longer match. Rejection, as though you were offered and turned down, as though something assessed you and found you insufficient, as though the distance that opened between you and your old life was a verdict passed on your worth. You have been rehearsing that verdict, quietly, privately, in the hours after conversations that felt hollow, and mornings when you could not account for why the world felt increasingly like somewhere you were visiting rather than somewhere you lived. That interpretation is the first thing the Arcturian intelligence requires you to release, not because your pain is wrong, not because what you lost did not matter, but because the word rejection assigns the cause of the distance to a defect inside you, when the actual cause is a process happening around you, through you, and ahead of you simultaneously. The Arcturian High Council does not read what you have been living through as a judgment passed on your value. It reads it as a separation phase, and a separation phase is not the same thing as rejection. It is something older, more structured, and far more directional than the ordinary collapse of a relationship or the quiet withdrawal of a community. Rejection is a closed door. Separation is the road itself turning, pulling away from familiar terrain, becoming something the old map was never designed to show. Rejection is what happens when you are turned away. Separation is what happens when the path beneath you begins to diverge from the path that once surrounded you, and the two can no longer pretend to travel together. That distinction is not semantic. It is diagnostic. And if you have been carrying the weight of what you call your rejections as evidence of your own deficiency, then what this transmission is doing right now is not comforting you. It is correcting the record. It is reattributing cause. It is naming what was happening while you are still calling it something else. The wound is real. The interpretation of the wound is not. And until the interpretation changes, the wound stays open in a way that cannot be healed, because you keep applying solutions designed for a problem you were never actually facing. The first recognition that opens inside a genuine separation phase is the feeling that ordinary conversation has stopped reaching you. Not that people have become hostile. Not that there is open conflict or visible rupture. Simply that something in the quality of the exchange has changed, and the change cannot be argued away or repaired by trying harder. You may have sat in rooms full of people who knew your name, spoken in circles that once held you comfortably, returned to environments that once made you feel located and seen, and discovered that something in you was absent from the interaction, even while you were physically present. The words were going in. They were simply not landing where they used to land. The frequency of the old circle was running at one register. You were running at another, and neither side could quite explain the gap. You sat with people who cared about you, and still came home feeling more alone than when you left. And you could not name why, without it sounding like ingratitude. This is not social anxiety. This is not depression. This is not a personality defect or a failure of effort or evidence that you are difficult to love. This is the first visible signature of root refinement. When an Arcturian selected line begins to move away from an older configuration, the earliest sensation is not dramatic separation. It is frequency mismatch. The line you are on begins to resonate at a different register than the environments you still physically occupy. You have not left yet. The old circle has not formally ended. But the resonance is gone. And where resonance was, there is now only surface. Interactions that once felt like contact now feel like proximity. Proximity without transmission. Presence without recognition. And surface feels like distance. And distance, when it cannot be explained and cannot be reversed by effort alone, is eventually interpreted as rejection, because rejection is the only word most people have been given for a separation they did not choose and cannot understand. You tried to close the gap. That is worth naming directly. You made yourself more available, more transparent, more accommodating. You reached back across the distance with extra effort, extra explanation, extra willingness to be the one who repairs. You softened your language. You showed up anyway. You initiated more than you wanted to, stayed longer than you needed to, made yourself smaller and quieter in spaces that once received you fully, hoping that somewhere in the compression you would find the fit again. And what you found was not reciprocal connection restored. What you found was more distance, because the distance was not a product of misunderstanding or insufficient effort. The distance was the path itself diverging, and no amount of effort closes a divergence that has already been set in motion at the structural level of the root. The second pattern that becomes visible inside a separation phase is what could be called the cascade of departures. Not one loss that can be grieved cleanly and explained, but a sequence of losses that seem to arrive together or in rapid succession, without a single clear cause that accounts for all of them. The friendship that goes cold without a definitive ending, just a gradual cooling you noticed too late to reverse. The professional environment that stops fitting in ways that are difficult to articulate to anyone outside it. The family dynamic that becomes increasingly strained at precisely the gatherings that once felt like anchors. The community that once gave you a sense of location that now makes you feel like a guest in a space that used to be home. These departures arrive not as a single rupture, but as a pattern, a wave of incompatibilities surfacing simultaneously, as though something underneath the visible layer of your life has shifted, and every relationship sitting on top of it has been quietly destabilized. From inside that experience, the mind reaches for a single explanation. Something must be wrong with me. I must be the common factor. I must be the source of this pattern. And the self-blame that follows is not irrational, given the information available to the viewer from inside the experience. It is actually a reasonable attempt to locate cause. The problem is that the viewer is locating cause in the wrong place. The common factor is not a defect. The common factor is the path. The path is the one thing that connects every departure, every distance, every collapse of fit, and the path is moving. The path is being refined. The cascade of departures is not evidence of a flaw at the center. It is evidence of a route in transition. The ground has changed. The things resting on the old ground are shifting. And that is not your failure. That is the natural consequence of structuring movement at a level deeper than the relationships themselves. The Arcturian intelligence reads cascades of relational loss in a specific way, not as punishment, not as abandonment of the viewer by forces that were meant to protect them, but as the external environment beginning to register a change in the line that the viewer has not yet been fully shown. The people falling away are falling away because the line can no longer sustain them in proximity to the viewer's path, not because they are bad. Not always because they are harmful, sometimes simply because the route no longer includes them. A path that is narrowing toward its actual purpose will shed what it cannot carry forward, not through cruelty, but through an incompatibility that deepens until proximity becomes unsustainable. And routes that no longer include certain presences will, with or without the viewer's conscious direction, begin to reduce their hold. The grip loosens, the frequency thins. What was once a relationship becomes a memory still wearing the costume of a present tense connection. What leaves is not always what hurt you. Sometimes, what leaves is what simply can no longer travel at the speed of what you are becoming. What has been exposed in you does not need more self-blame. It needs clearer recognition and proper guidance. If you know this message touched a process that has already started, Chosen One Manifest, the protocol for selected souls, was built for exactly that threshold. It is a structured path protocol for those whose route is already narrowing and who need to understand the logic of the separation before fear mislabels it as failure. It will not tell you that you are special. It will tell you what is being removed, what is being prepared, and how to move through this phase without misreading every loss as evidence against yourself. The complete access point is in the first pinned comment, but only for a limited window. The third pattern is one that many viewers will recognize with a particular sharpness, the experience of being misunderstood at precisely the moment you were trying hardest to be clear. This is one of the most disorienting features of a separation phase. You find yourself in a conversation where you are expressing yourself with unusual precision, unusual honesty, unusual willingness to be vulnerable or transparent, and the person on the other side receives something almost entirely different from what you transmitted. Not out of malice, not because they were not listening, but because the interpretive frame they are working from no longer maps onto the frequency of what you are carrying. They hear the words. They simply process them through a register that no longer aligns with the one you are speaking from. You reach across the distance with the clearest language you have, and what arrives on the other side is a distorted version, flattened, misread, sometimes even inverted from what you sent. And you watch that happen repeatedly across multiple people and multiple conversations, and something in you begins to collapse inward. Not dramatically, quietly, the way a structure goes quiet before it changes shape. The result is a translation failure so consistent, so repeated, so immune to correction, that you begin to question not your communication, but your communicability. You begin to wonder whether you are capable of being understood at all. And that question, once it takes root, starts to reshape how you present yourself. You pre-edit, you simplify before you speak. You decide in advance which parts of your interior experience are too far from the available register to even attempt to transmit. You begin to live in an abridged version of yourself, not because you are dishonest, but because full transmission has stopped being possible in the environments you currently occupy. That question is the most dangerous product of a separation phase lived without correct interpretation. Because if you answer it with a yes, if you conclude that you are fundamentally incommunicable, fundamentally too much, or too strange, or too interior to be known by others, then you have taken a structural feature of path transition and turned it into a personal verdict. You have made the root's incompatibility into your own disorder. You have located the problem inside yourself, when the problem is environmental. And that misattribution is one of the things this transmission exists to dismantle. You are not incommunicable. You are increasingly incompatible with an older interpretive environment. That is not the same thing. One is a flaw that follows you. The other is a mismatch that resolves when the environment changes. And the environment is already in the process of changing because the path is already in the process of moving. The fourth pattern arrives with a particular kind of exhaustion. It is the exhaustion of performing continuity with an identity that no longer fits. The version of you that the old circle knew, the version that fit the old environment, the version that the old relationships were built around, that version has been changing at a rate the external world has not yet been shown. The interior shift happened first and has been happening longer than you may have consciously tracked. And in the absence of new environments that can recognize what you are becoming, you have been doing something quietly and relentlessly consuming. You have been maintaining the performance of the old version to avoid the cost of the gap, showing up as the person who still belongs there, responding in the register of the person who still finds meaning there, using the vocabulary of someone whose identity remains what it was, because to reveal the full extent of the change would be to accelerate the very separations that feel too frightening to face at speed. Better to compress than to collapse, the survival response says. Better to perform than to disappear. This performance is not dishonesty. It is a survival response to a genuine structural problem. The identity has moved, but the new line has not yet made itself visible enough for you to stop holding the old one in place. And so you maintain. You attend the gatherings. You say the expected things. You laugh at the right moments and nod at the right intervals and perform enough recognition of the old world to keep the old world from requiring you to explain why you are no longer fully there. And the maintenance costs something deeper every time. It costs the sensation of being recognized, because the recognition you receive from the old circle is recognition of a performance, and a performance, however skillfully maintained, cannot give you the experience of being seen. It can only give you the experience of being approved. Approval feels like warmth from a distance. Being seen feels like contact, and you have been warm enough for long enough to know the difference by now. What you are longing for is not approval. What you are longing for is location. You want someone to recognize not the version of you that still makes sense to the old world, but the version that has already been moving towards something the old world cannot name. You want to be met in the interior of what you are becoming, not in the exterior of what you have already passed through. And that kind of meeting cannot happen in environments that are calibrated to a version of you that the path has already moved beyond. The fifth pattern is the narrowing, the sense that life is contracting rather than expanding, that the field of possibility is reducing, that where you once had multiple directions available, multiple environments, multiple relationships, multiple futures that felt open, there is now a single corridor, and you are not entirely sure where it leads. Options that once appeared viable have gone quiet. Doors that once seemed open have simply stopped presenting themselves as relevant. The peripheral movement of the old life, the multiple tracks, the branching possibilities, has slowed, and what remains feels narrower, more specific, more pressured, not richer, not yet, just narrower. The Arcturian reading of this narrowing is precise. It is not contraction. It is root reduction. And root reduction is what happens when a selected line is cleared of its alternative branches, not because the alternatives were without value, but because sustaining them would mean splitting the energy of the path across directions that cannot all be traveled simultaneously. A route that is being prepared for its actual function cannot also hold every possibility that once seemed available. The narrowing is the route becoming singular, the route becoming coherent, the route becoming what it is actually for, rather than what it has been carrying alongside what it was for. The branches that have dropped were not failures of potential, they were the path, releasing what it cannot use in the next phase. Inside the experience, it feels like loss of possibility. Inside the Arcturian interpretation, it is the first sign that possibility is being concentrated, that the path is losing its peripheral noise and beginning to hold only what it is actually made to carry. A road with fewer exits is not a road that leads nowhere. It is a road that leads somewhere specific, and the specificity is the point. The sixth pattern is spiritual loneliness, and it must be named separately because it is distinct from ordinary loneliness in ways that make it uniquely difficult to explain and uniquely difficult to receive compassion for. Ordinary loneliness is the absence of company. Spiritual loneliness is the absence of resonance. You can be surrounded by people and feel it completely. You can be in conversation, in community, in a room full of warmth and goodwill, and still feel it pressing against the inside of your chest like something trying to name itself. The sense that no one in proximity is receiving what you are actually transmitting. That the interior of your experience, the real register of your awareness, the thing you most need to be met in, is simply not being reached by any of the current contacts available to you. You are present. You are even engaged, but the deepest frequency of what you carry is broadcasting into a silence the room does not notice. This loneliness is often the most privately shaming aspect of a separation phase because it feels ungrateful. You have people, you have relationships, however strained, you have community, however distant, and yet the loneliness is profound and specific and persistent in a way that social contact does not resolve. More contact does not cure it. Busier schedules do not reduce it. You can fill every hour with human proximity and still return to an interior silence that feels like the loneliest landscape you have ever inhabited. And so you blame yourself for wanting something the available relationships cannot give. You tell yourself you are too demanding, too interior, too spiritually arrogant to be satisfied with ordinary human warmth. What the Arcturian reading restores is this: spiritual loneliness before repositioning is not evidence of arrogance or excess. It is evidence of accurate perception. You are perceiving correctly that the current contacts cannot meet the current register. You are not imagining the gap. You are reading it precisely. That perception is not a symptom of your dysfunction. It is a measurement of your displacement. And measurements do not lie, they report. And what this one is reporting is that the environment you are currently in is no longer calibrated to receive what you are actually carrying. That is not a verdict on the contacts. It is a read of the frequency gap. And frequency gaps close not by lowering your frequency, but by moving toward environments where the frequency is shared. The repositioning is what comes after the loneliness. But the loneliness has to be correctly understood first, or the viewer will exhaust themselves trying to resolve a structural condition through relational effort alone. You cannot close a frequency gap by trying harder within the old circle. You can only move toward what the root is actually preparing you for. And the preparation is already underway, whether or not the new environment has yet become visible. The loneliness you are carrying is not evidence that no one will ever meet you at that register. It is evidence that the meeting has not happened yet, and yet is not never. Yet is a location on the route, not a permanent condition. What this transmission has been doing, through every pattern named, every recognition delivered, every reframe proposed, is this. It has been returning the cause of your experience to the correct address, not to a defect inside you, not to a failure of worthiness or communicability or social competence, but to a process that has been underway longer than you have had language for it, a process that has been operating at the level of the root, the line, the structural incompatibility between what you are becoming and what you have been asked to remain. Every loss readdressed, every silence reinterpreted, every narrowing reread as a form of precision rather than punishment. The Arcturian High Council does not read your separation as loss alone. It reads it as the path insisting on its own coherence. It reads every departure, every narrowing, every silence, every misunderstanding, every room that no longer holds you, as the root reducing itself to what can actually sustain the line. A tree pruned is not a tree diminished. It is a tree prepared for the weight of what is coming. The branches that were removed could not have held it. The ones that remain are being shaped for exactly that load. What left was not leaving because you failed. What left was leaving because it could not travel where the root is going. That is not rejection. That is separation. And separation, unlike rejection, has direction. You are not discarded. You are separated. And the separation knows where it is going, even when you do not. The root has coordinates you have not yet been shown. The losses were not random. The silences were not arbitrary. The rooms that stopped fitting were not condemning you. They were releasing you. And release, from inside the grip of the old environment, can feel indistinguishable from abandonment until the language changes, until the interpretation catches up to the process, until you stop calling the pruning by the name of the wound. Say this out loud if you are ready to receive it. I do not call the pruning rejection. What is leaving my life is not random. I was separated, and the separation is preparation. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this separation has already touched your life. It could be people falling away, the feeling of not belonging, repeated distance, unexplained isolation, or the sense that your old path no longer fits. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who feels alone, cut off, or misunderstood and cannot explain why. And if you are ready to understand the separation instead of blaming yourself, subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a path already in motion, and this is only the beginning.